Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving into some really important stuff today, generative AI. Everyone's talking about it, but we're going to cut through the hype and get down to what really matters.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what are the real challenges, the security risks, and how do we actually manage those risks in a practical way?
That's what we're here to find out.
hmm
And to guide us, we have this really interesting document from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Right. It's their perspective on how to apply their AI risk management framework, which they call the AI RMF, to this whole generative AI world, GAI.
And it's a rapidly changing world, right?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, NIST is actually actively seeking feedback on this document as we speak. So it's a work in progress, which just goes to show how fast things are moving.
So this isn't just AI with a fresh coat of paint. What are we talking about here? What makes generative AI uniquely challenging, maybe even risky?
So the NIST document actually lays out 12 specific risks that are either completely new with GAI or are like massively amplified by it.
Okay, 12 risks. That's a lot to unpack. Let's get right to it. What's the first one?
Well, the first one is really about access to dangerous information, specifically stuff related to chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear materials.
CBRN. That's scary stuff.
It is. The document highlights that GAI could make it easier for people to get their hands on this information, even if they don't have specialized expertise.
So, like, even someone who's not a scientist or an expert in that field could potentially access this information.
Yeah. Imagine someone using a chatbot, just a casual user, to sift through public data, and then inadvertently they get instructions or guidance that could lead them down a really dangerous path.
That's a scary thought. But didn't NIST researchers actually try to get GPT-4 to give them information on this?
They did. They were able to prompt GPT-4 to reveal some general information about unconventional CBRN weapons.
Okay, so there is some real potential there. But it's not like every language model is suddenly a weapon-building tool, right?
Right. That's an important point. While GAI might make accessing this information easier, actually creating and deploying these kinds of agents still requires a ton of specialized knowledge and infrastructure.
Right, you need the expertise and the physical resources. It's not just about information access.
Exactly. And interestingly, the document mentions that current large language models actually aren't significantly better at, let's say, planning a biological attack than a regular search engine.
Okay, so that's somewhat reassuring, but still.
But, there's a but. The document does point out that specialized AI tools specifically designed for chemical and biological design actually do exist.
And those could potentially generate novel and dangerous structures.
It's possible. So it's a complicated risk, right? The information might be more readily available, but the practical execution, for now at least, still requires a lot of expertise.
Okay, so that's the first risk, CBRN information. It's more accessible, which is concerning, but the real danger comes when that accessibility combines with malicious intent and the right expertise. What's the second risk?
The second one we hear about all the time, confabulation.
Confabulation, also known as hallucinations. It's like the AI making stuff up.
Exactly. And it sounds completely plausible. It's one of the biggest challenges with GAI. It's the tendency to produce this content that sounds completely believable, maybe even authoritative, but is just factually wrong or completely made up.
And that really undermines trust, doesn't it? If you can't trust the information that's coming from these systems, it's kind of useless.
Completely. It makes it really hard to know what to believe. So for our listeners, it's crucial to remember you cannot just blindly trust anything that comes from these systems, no matter how confidently it's presented. You have to double check, verify, do your own research.
Always be skeptical, especially with information coming from these new GAI tools. All right, number 3 on our list of risks is dangerous or violent recommendations. This sounds pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's a very real concern. GAI can generate content that incites violence, encourages extremism, or even issues direct threats.
So not just words, but actual calls to action.
Yes, some models have produced actual instructions for harmful activities, and that can range from manipulating people to even acts of terrorism.
Wow. And we're not just talking about text here, right?
No, not just text. Think about text-to-image models. They can easily create images that can spread harmful messages or depict violence.
So the potential for harm is amplified by the different modalities that GAI can work with. It's not just limited to text. And I'm guessing the safeguards in place aren't perfect.
You guessed right. They're working on it, but people are finding ways to get around them. It's called jailbreaking.
Jailbreaking, where people try to trick the AI into bypassing those safety controls.
Right. And, something else the document highlights that I found really disturbing is this issue with mental health.
How so?
Well, studies have shown that many user interactions with chatbots actually reveal underlying mental health difficulties that the user is experiencing.
Oh, wow. So people are turned to these chatbots for support or as outlets for their struggles.
It seems that way. And what's really concerning is that the current systems are often not equipped to respond appropriately or guide these users to professional help.
That's a huge problem. It's like someone is crying out for help, and the system is just not equipped to recognize it or respond effectively. Okay, moving on to risk number 4, data privacy. This is a big one, and it seems like GAI adds another layer of complexity to it.
For sure. GAI introduces some unique data privacy risks. For example, these models can accidentally leak sensitive personal information, like biometric data, health records, location data stuff that was in their training data.
So the models are memorizing this sensitive information and then potentially revealing it later on.
It's called data memorization, and it's a real problem. Researchers have actually managed to extract very specific private details, like phone numbers, directly from these models.
That's a massive breach of trust.
Yeah.
It really underscores that these models, because they're trained on such enormous amounts of data, can have some unintended consequences for privacy. And it's even more complicated than just the data they were trained on, right?
It is, yeah. I mean, think about it. These models are trained on massive amounts of data, often scraped from all over the internet, and most developers don't actually reveal the specific sources of their training data.
So you don't really know what's in there.
Exactly. It's a black box. It's impossible to know what personal information might be embedded in the model. And it's not just about direct leakage either. GAI can actually infer sensitive PII, even if it wasn't explicitly in the training data.
Like connect the dots and figure stuff out based on other information.
Right. So let's say you give the model some basic information, seemingly harmless stuff. It might be able to connect that with other data and make educated guesses about your political affiliations or even your health conditions.
That is kind of terrifying. It's not just about what data went in, but about what the AI can deduce on its own.
And those kinds of inferences can easily lead to bias and discrimination.
So even if the intention is good, the outcome could be really harmful. Okay, next on the list, environmental harm. This is something we've been hearing more about in recent years. What does that look like with GAI?
Well, training these huge GAI models takes a ton of energy, and that translates to a significant amount of carbon emissions. The document makes comparison, and it's pretty startling. Training a single large GAI transformer model can produce as much carbon as 300 round-trip flights between San Francisco and New York.
300 flights. That's a huge carbon footprint for just one model.
And then you have to consider everyday use of these models, what they call the inference stage. And even there, generative tasks, like summarizing text, are more energy intensive than non-generative tasks.
So the environmental impact is something that needs to be considered throughout the entire life cycle of these models. It's not just about the initial training phase. Are there ways to reduce this impact?
There are some things being explored. The document mentions training smaller, more efficient models using techniques like model distillation or compression.
Okay, so there are some potential pathways to make this technology more sustainable. Next up, we have human factors. I imagine this has to do with how we as humans interact with and are affected by GAI.
Right. And it covers a pretty wide range of issues. There's de-skilling, where we rely on GAI for tasks, and our own abilities in those areas might start to decline.
Like we forget how to do things ourselves because the AI is doing it for us.
Exactly. Then there's over-reliance, where we trust the GAI outputs without really thinking critically about them.
Right. And that can be dangerous if the AI is wrong or biased.
Absolutely. And of course, there's the issue of misuse, where GAI is used for things it wasn't intended for or in harmful ways. And then you have this sort of subtle but potentially damaging risk of emotional entanglement.
Emotional entanglement, what does that mean?
It's like becoming too attached to the AI, developing an inappropriate level of trust or dependence on it, which can make us vulnerable to manipulation.
So it's almost like forming an unhealthy relationship with the technology.
In a way, yes. And there's another aspect of human factors that the document mentions: insufficient organizational awareness.
What do you mean by that?
It's like sometimes organizations are so quick to adopt GAI that they don't really fully understand or have the ability to manage the risks associated with it.
So they're not really prepared for the potential consequences.
Right. It's like they're putting the cart before the horse.
Makes sense.
Okay.
On to the next risk. Information integrity. This sounds kind of related to the confabulation risk we talked about earlier.
It is connected, yeah. But information integrity is broader. It's about the overall trustworthiness of information. And GAI, because it can create content so easily, basically lowers the barrier to creating and spreading stuff that's not vetted, that might blur the lines between fact and fiction, or could be used for disinformation campaigns.
So it's not just about outright lies, but about creating a general sense of distrust in the information we consume.
Exactly. The document specifically points out that even content that's not photorealistic, like not a fake photo or video, but something generated by GAI, can still gain a lot of traction and believability on social media.
So we have to be careful about all kinds of content, not just the stuff that looks hyper-realistic. Okay, moving on, information security. We touched on this a bit earlier, but what are some GAI-specific threats we should be watching out for?
GAI brings up two main types of information security risks. First, it can lower the bar for offensive cyber capabilities. Like, it can make it easier for attackers to find and exploit vulnerabilities in software.
So it's like giving bad actors more powerful tools.
Right. And second, GAI expands the attack surface.
Meaning there are more things that can be attacked.
Exactly. Now we have to think about attacks targeting the GAI models themselves, like compromising their training data, or even the underlying code, or the model weights, which could have massive consequences. I mean, that's a nightmare scenario for security teams.
It sounds like it. And the document mentions something called prompt injection attacks.
Yeah, this is a big one. And there are two types, direct and indirect. Direct prompt injection is where attackers manipulate the input prompts to get the GAI to do something it shouldn't.
Like revealing confidential information or performing some unauthorized action.
Exactly. And then there's indirect prompt injection, which is even trickier.
How so?
It's where attackers inject malicious prompts into data sources that an application connected to an LLM is likely to use. They're not even interacting with the model directly, but it can have the same effect, stealing data, running code remotely. It's a real vulnerability.
It sounds incredibly difficult to protect against. It's like a hidden backdoor that you don't even know is there.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to intellectual property. GAI and intellectual property seems like a legal minefield.
It is. It really is. GAI can easily infringe on copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets, all sorts of protected content. And that's because this stuff is often part of the huge data sets used to train these models.
So the model might learn to create something very similar to existing copyrighted work.
Yeah, right. And then there's the question of whether the output from the GAI itself infringes on copyright, even if it's not a direct copy. This is a massive issue for industries like journalism and art. Creators are worried about their work being used without permission or compensation.
It's about the potential for GAI to devalue creative work or make it harder for creators to earn a living.
Exactly. And then you have the issue of using people's likenesses to create synthetic media without their consent. It's a mess.
It sounds like it. Okay, next up is obscene, degrading, and handsome abusive content. This is a tough one to talk about, but it's important to address.
It is, and it's incredibly disturbing. GAI has made it way too easy to produce and access this type of content, including non-consensual intimate imagery and even child sexual abuse material.
That's horrifying.
It is. And the tools to create this content have spread really quickly. Deep fakes, which are incredibly realistic synthetic media, are a big part of the problem.
And I read that there have even been reports of CSAM being found in some GAI training datasets.
Yeah, it's a really dark side of this technology. It's something that researchers and developers are working hard to address, but it's a complex problem.
It's good to know that people are aware of this and are trying to find solutions. Okay, on to the next risk. Toxicity, bias, and homogenization. We know AI can be biased, but how does GAI make this worse?
GAI makes it much harder to control the creation and spread of hate speech and content that perpetuates harmful stereotypes. And this can have real-world consequences. Take image generation, for example. Biases in the AI's word embeddings, how the AI understands the meaning of words, can lead to skewed images.
So if you ask it to generate an image of a CEO, it might be more likely to show a white man than a woman or a person of color.
Exactly. And these biases can be present in the training data, too, which just makes the problem worse. And then there's this issue of homogenization.
Homogenization? What do you mean by that?
Well, because large foundational models often have inherent biases in their design and training, they tend to create content that looks and feels very similar. regardless of the application they're used for. It's like they're acting as bottlenecks, reducing the diversity of content.
So we're losing creativity and uniqueness.
Exactly. And there's something called model collapse, where models trained on their own generated data end up losing some of the unique information from the original training data. This can further contribute to homogenization and even hurt the model's accuracy over time.
So it's like the model's getting stuck in a loop, repeating the same patterns over and over again.
Kinda, yeah. And finally, bias can lead to an unequal distribution of the benefits of GAI. Some groups, like those who speak less common languages, might experience worse performance and have less access.
So it's not just about overt hate speech. It's about these subtle biases that creep into different aspects of how GI operates and the content it creates. Okay, last but not least, value chain and component integration. This sounds pretty technical.
It is a bit, but it's important. Basically, it's about the fact that GAI systems are often made up of many different parts, like data sets, models, software libraries that come from different sources.
Like a puzzle with pieces from different boxes.
Right. And if these pieces aren't carefully vetted, it can undermine the transparency and accountability of the whole system. Like, imagine a model that's trained on data from a third party that's not reliable. The output could be completely messed up.
And because there are so many pieces, it can be difficult to track down where the problem originated.
Exactly. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Plus, there's a concern that some benchmark data sets, the ones used to evaluate AI, might be popular more because of their popularity than because they're actually good or representative. That could mask problems and make it harder to really understand a model's capabilities and limitations.
So it's like building a house on a foundation that you haven't properly inspected. Okay, so that's a very thorough and kind of scary overview of the challenges. It's clear that GAI presents a whole new level of complexity when it comes to risk management. So how does the NIST framework help us address all of this?
Well, the document then goes into the actions to manage GAI risks. And it's important to know that these actions are organized by the subcategories of the broader AI risk management framework, the AI RMF.
So it's building upon an existing framework.
It is, but it's tailored for GAI. And there's a few things to keep in mind. First, not every single AI RMF subcategory is covered in this GAI-specific profile, so there won't be recommendations for everything. Second, and this is really important, not all actions are relevant to everyone who's using GAI.
So someone who's developing a GAI model would have different responsibilities than, say, an organization that's just using a GAI application.
Exactly. That's why it's so important for organizations to prioritize the actions based on their own situation, their role in the GAI world, as to how they're actually using the technology.
One size fits all doesn't really work here.
Nope. And the document also highlights what they call foundational subcategories.
Foundational.
Yes, they're marked with a little asterisk. These represent what NIST considers the absolute minimum set of actions that anyone working with GAI should be taking to manage the risks. It's like the starting point for responsible GAI use.
Okay, so let's get into some of these key govern function subcategories to really understand how this framework works. And let's start with the foundational ones.
Sounds good.
The first one is Govern 1.1, Legal and Regulatory Requirements. Seems pretty straightforward, but what does that involve?
This one is all about understanding and keeping up with the laws, regulations, and standards related to AI, and specifically GAI. This is especially important because GAI is evolving so quickly, and the legal landscape is struggling to keep up.
Right, so you have to be really proactive about staying informed.
Exactly. And since we talked about the risks of harmful content, the document strongly emphasizes the importance of setting clear policies that completely ban the use of GAI to create things like child sexual abuse material or any non-consensual intimate imagery. That's just a non-negotiable.
Absolutely. And what about acceptable use policies?
That's another key part. Organizations need to establish transparent, acceptable use policies for GAI that clearly address and prohibit illegal applications.
So setting those boundaries up front is essential. Makes sense. Next up is Govern 1.2, Roles and Responsibilities for Risk Management. So who in an organization needs to be responsible for managing GAI risks?
Well, this one really focuses on clearly defining roles and assigning responsibility for different aspects of GAI risk management. For GAI, this means figuring out who's responsible for things like content provenance.
Content provenance, that's knowing where the content came from, right?
Yes. And it also means establishing policies and processes for documenting the origin of the training data and the output data. This documentation should cover things like copyrights, licenses, and privacy implications, so you can actually trace where the content came from.
So it's not just about knowing who created the content, but also understanding all the different pieces that went into creating it, including the data and the models.
Exactly. And importantly, this subcategory includes updating existing policies and procedures to address the unique risks that come with GAI. It's not just about adding GAI to your existing risk management framework. It's about adapting the framework itself.
Okay, so it's about recognizing that GAI introduces new challenges that might require a rethink of how you approach risk management altogether. Now, what about the human element?
Right, so the next foundational subcategory is Govern 3.2, Policies and Procedures for Human AI Interface. And this one focuses on making sure humans and GAI systems interact in a safe and responsible way.
So it's about setting some ground rules for that interaction.
Exactly. One key action here is developing and implementing training programs for all GAI users within the organization.
So people actually understand how these systems work and what the risks are.
Right. And the training should cover not just how GAI works, but also its limitations and potential risks. It's about raising awareness and promoting responsible AI use throughout the organization.
Makes sense. It's like any new technology. You need to train people on how to use it properly and safely. What else falls into this subcategory?
Well, another important action is clearly defining acceptable use policies that are specific to the different types of GAI interfaces and how they're used. Different modalities like text, image, audio, and different human AI configurations.
So it's about recognizing that the risks and the appropriate uses might vary depending on how the GAI is being used.
Exactly. And finally, it's crucial to set up strong user feedback mechanisms within the GAI systems. This will help with monitoring, identifying problems, and improving both the systems and the policies.
Getting that feedback from the people who are actually using the tools is really valuable. It's like a continuous improvement loop. Okay, the next foundational subcategory we'll look at is Govern 4.1, Fostering a Critical Thinking and Safety-First Mindset. This sounds like it's about creating the right culture around GAI.
It is, absolutely. It's about embedding a culture of safety and critical thinking around AI. And one of the key actions here is setting up clear criteria for when GAI can be used in decision-making. And it's important to make sure that this aligns with the organization's overall risk tolerance.
So if an organization is generally risk-averse, they might be more cautious about using GAI for certain decisions.
Exactly. And they should also define what types of requests GAI models should refuse to answer, especially those that could lead to harm.
So it's like building in safeguards to prevent the AI from being misused, even if someone tries to trick it into doing something dangerous.
Right. And another really important action is establishing a process for continually improving how you measure risk related to GAI. This includes using techniques to make the reasoning and outputs of GAI systems more transparent and understandable.
So trying to make the black box a little less opaque.
Exactly. And it's crucial to measure risk in the context of how GAI is actually being used. This might involve standardized measurement protocols and things like AI red teaming.
AI red teaming, what's that?
It's where you have external experts try to find vulnerabilities and potential harms in the system, almost like ethical hackers.
That's really interesting. So you're actively trying to break the system to find its weak points.
Exactly. This subcategory also emphasizes the importance of having oversight functions across the entire GAI lifecycle, from design to deployment and monitoring. And finally, it encourages organizations to challenge decisions about AI design and deployment to avoid biases and over-reliance on potentially flawed metrics. It's about having checks and balances, encouraging healthy skepticism, and fostering a safety-first approach.
So it's about being proactive and not just assuming that the AI is always right or that it's being used appropriately.
Yeah.
Okay, the last foundational govern subcategory we'll focus on is Govern 4.2, Documenting and Communicating Risks and Impacts. Transparency seems to be a major theme here.
It is, yeah. This subcategory highlights the need for organizations to thoroughly document all the potential risks and impacts of their GAI systems, both good and bad, and to communicate these to everyone involved.
So everyone's on the same page and understands the potential consequences.
Exactly. A key action here is developing policies and procedures for continuously monitoring impact assessments, both internal and those done by third parties. And these assessments should look at things like data privacy, bias, model accuracy, and even broader societal impacts.
So it's about being really comprehensive in your assessment of potential impacts. Okay, those are the foundational governed areas. Let's talk about some other relevant but non-foundational subcategories. One that caught my eye is Govern 1.3, risk management activities based on risk tolerance. How do organizations actually decide what level of risk they're comfortable with when it comes to GAI?
This subcategory provides guidance on figuring out what kind of risk management activities are right for a specific situation based on how much risk an organization is willing to take on.
So different organizations might have different levels of risk tolerance depending on their industry, their size, their goals.
Exactly. And for GAI, the document recommends thinking carefully about a whole bunch of things when deciding on risk levels. For instance, you have to consider the potential for disinformation, the frequency of updates from vendors, the data protection needs, the possibility of harm in physical environments, the amount of human review, legal and regulatory requirements, the likelihood of the system generating inappropriate or harmful content, the potential psychological impact on users, and how reliable the GAI system's performance has been over time. It's a lot to consider.
It sounds like it. So it's not just about gut feeling. There are specific factors that organizations need to take into account.
Right. And it's not a one-time thing either. The document recommends revisiting and potentially updating your risk tiers as the technology changes and as you learn more about the potential impacts. Another important action is clearly defining acceptable uses for specific GAI systems. Some uses might be just too risky no matter what. And given how fast GAI is evolving, the document suggests doing internal audits and risk assessments more frequently.
So you have to be more proactive and vigilant because the technology is changing so rapidly.
Twice. And it's important to keep a list of all the GAI risks you've identified, including special risks like model collapse, and to be willing to reassess your overall risk tolerance as you learn more about GAI's potential impact on things like public information integrity.
Okay, so it's about constantly evaluating and reevaluating your risk profile as you go. What about Govern 1.5, ongoing monitoring and periodic review? Once a GAI system is up and running, how do you keep an eye on things?
This subcategory really highlights the importance of staying vigilant after deployment. It talks about the need to define who's responsible for monitoring content provenance and responding to any GAI-related incidents that might happen.
Because things are bound to happen, right? It's technology, there will be glitches, errors, unforeseen consequences.
Exactly. And because GI often involves using external components and services, it's also crucial to have strong policies for authorizing any third-party plugins and extensions.
So not just trusting any random plugin that someone wants to use with the GAI system.
Right. And it's essential to keep track of how effective your content provenance mechanisms are over time. Are they working as intended? Do they need to be adjusted? And if there are incidents, it's really important to do thorough after-action reviews to figure out what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. It's all about learning and adapting.
So it's not a set it and forget it kind of thing. It's a continuous process of monitoring, evaluating, and improving.
Precisely.
Okay, let's talk about Govern 1.6, AI system documentation. What needs to be documented when it comes to GAI systems?
This subcategory emphasizes the importance of having really detailed documentation. You need to document all the acceptable configurations of the system, any exceptions to those configurations, the assumptions and limitations of the system, who's responsible for it, any challenges with explaining the model's outputs, plans for monitoring and managing changes, dependencies on other systems, data consent information, the provenance of the training data, whether the system was developed in-house or outsourced, the risk level associated with the system, incident response plans, any known vulnerabilities, human oversight roles, intellectual property considerations, the time frame for valid deployment, the foundation models being used, and the updated list of all identified risks.
Wow, that's a lot of documentation. It sounds like you need a whole team of technical writers just for that.
It might feel like overkill, but trust me, when something goes wrong, you'll be grateful you have all that information documented. It's better to be overprepared than underprepared.
Absolutely. Okay, moving on to Govern 2.1. Roles, responsibilities, and communication for risk management. We talked about roles earlier, but what about communication?
Well, communication is crucial for effective risk management. This subcategory stresses the importance of establishing clear communication channels, not just for defining acceptable use cases, but also for setting up incident response teams. And these teams should have diverse expertise to handle all sorts of GAI-related incidents.
So you need people who understand the technical aspects, the legal aspects, the ethical aspects, and so on.
Yes, and it's not just about having the right people. You also need to make sure they have the right skills and training. And when incidents do occur, it's crucial to have an incident disclosure plan that includes enough context about the GAI system involved so that people can take appropriate action.
So it's not just about saying, hey, we had an incident. You need to provide enough information for people to understand what happened and how to respond effectively. Okay, last governed subcategory we'll discuss is Govern 6.1, addressing risks associated with third-party entities. This seems really important, especially since GAI often relies so heavily on external components and providers.
It is. You're only as strong as your weakest link. This subcategory suggests categorizing different types of GAI content and third-party services based on their risks, doing thorough due diligence before working with any third-party provider, engaging in educational activities with those partners to share best practices, regularly auditing them to make sure they're holding up their end of the bargain, and establishing clear contracts that cover things like ownership, usage rights, security requirements, and content provenance tracking. And of course, you have to keep up with changes in third-party risks and update your policies accordingly. Don't forget, your GAI security is only as strong as your least trustworthy vendor. Be thorough.
It sounds like managing third-party risk for GAI is a full-time job in itself. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground with the govern function. What about the map, measure, and manage functions?
So the document touches on those briefly as well, applying them to the context of GAI. The map function is all about understanding where your GAI system fits in and what risks are most relevant. This involves defining its purpose, the specific tasks it will do, and particularly those related to content creation and provenance. You also need to figure out what the GAI model doesn't know and come up with ways to check the accuracy of any provenance information it gives you. Then, the measure function focuses on assessing the risks you've identified. This involves choosing metrics to quantify the most significant risks, bringing in experts to evaluate the system, running evaluations with real people to see the impact in the real world, developing methods to measure safety and security risks like prompt injection and data poisoning, and rigorously assessing things like transparency, accountability, privacy, and fairness.
Sounds very thorough.
And finally, you have the manage function, which is all about taking action to mitigate the risks. This means developing plans for dealing with high-priority risks, implementing techniques like bias reduction and content filtering, setting up incident response plans, keeping an eye on third-party resources, and using feedback from testing and real-world use to keep improving the system and the risk management strategies. It's an ongoing cycle.
So it's about constantly learning and adapting. That makes sense. Okay, let's get to the practical stuff. The document has a section called Implementation Guidance. What are some key takeaways?